everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm super excited about today's talk. I'm excited about all of them, but particularly because this is a topic I personally requested as one of the, there's a perk of putting this together. I really wanted to have something after the election to talk about election security, not knowing what would be happening. You know, would we know any results, would we not? And it looks like it's pretty good, although I understand our president's dissatisfied with some things currently as we speak. I just looked on Twitter. Not to send you on Twitter to do any of that. But anyway, to say that this is a really big, pressing issue for democracy. And we're really excited to have an in, through one of our faculty, of a guest speaker who is an expert in this, Jeremy Epstein. Epstein or Stein? Stein. Stein, thank you, Epstein. Who is a deputy director at NSF in the Computer and Network Systems, is that right? Division. A former program officer at NSF as well. Worked at DARPA, was leading,
Brandeis.
Pardon me?
The Brandeis program. I worked with several of your faculty here.
There you go. And has worked at SRI and has a really long and storied career. So we're really excited to have him and have him today in particular to be talking about this. I understand this is a very topical and brand new talk that was done on the plane this morning, which is entirely appropriate, which is awesome because we all do that. But in this case, it's even better. So please join me in welcoming Jeremy, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. As Kurt alludes, my son is a brand new faculty member here, and that's just the coolest thing as a parent for those of you who have children to think about having a child in this sort of space. So I did write this talk on the plane this morning, and that was intentional because I have a standard talk that I do about voting in elections, and I wanted this one to be different because there's all sorts of new and exciting stuff going on. So what I've tried to do is, well, actually, let me start with my disclaimer. The opinions I'm going to give you are my opinions, or maybe not even my opinions, but they're certainly not NSF's opinions. The election was 4 days ago. Any conclusions we might draw are about as firm as Jell-O, so things may change. I was actually getting emails and texts as I was flying across the country and thinking, oh, I should add that in, and I should add that in. So anyway, so what I'm trying to do is I'm assuming that none of you or almost none of you are focused on voting in elections. Is that true? Is anybody focused on voting in elections? Okay, so I tried to cover a wide landscape of stuff, and my goal at the end of this is that you're gonna have some sense of what some of the issues are technically. I'm not gonna go into any of the politics. There's one exception in one small space. But I'm staying on the technical side, but I'm going to try to give you a scope of all of the stuff that's going on in voting and technology across the country. And I've got some good examples from this year. There's some cool things. And I'm going to encourage you to read more. And so because I'm trying to be really broad, there's some jumping around. So I'll talk about something, and then I'll jump over and talk about another topic. And feel free to interrupt with questions. So that at the bottom is sort of some of the topics I'm going to cover. So let's start with who's responsible for voting in elections technology, because there's a lot of players in the game that you sort of have to understand because they affect what the results are. So there's a limited amount of federal oversight of voting in elections. There's something called the Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. It was started as a result of the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Those of you who are old enough, who remembers hanging chads? Okay, actually a fair number. So a hanging chad was in the 2000 election between Bush and Gore in Florida, and Florida's going to keep coming back in this discussion. They were using punch cards for voting. And you would punch out a hole in the card to represent the candidate you wanted. And if you didn't push hard enough, the piece of paper that was supposed to be the hole wouldn't come all the way off, and it would just sort of hang there. Or it might be dimpled, which was a term all of us learned that meant that it had been, you could see that it had been pushed through, and so it was curved, but it wasn't disconnected. And so there were all these debates about which votes how do you really count something where the hole wasn't there? And if you the more times you looked at these punch cards that represented the votes, they would change, because the little scraps of paper would sort of wear away the more times you held it up and looked at it. And there's a famous picture of a guy holding a magnifying glass, looking at this card, and the more times you look at it, the little chads would fall off. The chads are the little tiny pieces of paper. And there was a determination, gosh, we made that mistake. We're never going to make that mistake again. And so they created this thing called the Election Assistance Commission as a result of the federal law. And the Election Assistance Commission was going to establish rules on how we build voting machines, so we never had this problem again. And the result was they pushed everyone to go to computerized voting, which was going to be, there was never going to be a question what the intent of the voter was, because it was going to be binary. It was going to be yes or no. And this was great, except that nobody really thought very much about, well, computers aren't perfect, and what if they get hacked, or what if they're buggy, or things like that. And so it turned out that was probably the worst possible answer. But the Election Assistance Commission still exists, and it sets the standards. Well, except that it doesn't set the standards, because elections in the United States are actually run not by the federal government, but they're run by the states, and in some cases the counties and the cities. And so they give advice to the cities and the counties and the states about how to run elections, but they don't make any of the rules. And for political reasons, they sometimes are not so popular. There's a bill that's been pending in Congress to get rid of them. But they're the only game in town when it comes to writing standards. They can't enforce anything, they can only make recommendations. So that's what's going on at the federal level. At the state level, every state is different. California has historically been one of the best states in terms of regulating and making good things happen in voting technology. Their procurement in some states, it's at the federal, some states at the state level. In other cases, it's at the local level. So historically, California has not had the same sort of voting system across the state. There's something like 6 different voting systems now in use in California. So you move from Orange County to Los Angeles County, and you're going to see a completely different technology. And Los Angeles County is one of the most innovative counties in the entire country when it comes to election technology. And that part of that is because they're so damn big. So Dean Logan, who is head of elections for Los Angeles County, talks about how he has more voters in Los Angeles than 32 states. He has a fleet of helicopters that bring the ballots back to be counted on election day. It's just a completely unimaginable scope, especially if you compare what he does to a small town where there might be 1,000 voters or 2,000 voters. But yet we offer the same technologies to both. So he's doing some really innovative stuff in Los Angeles. If you're interested to look at what's going on in Los Angeles, it's probably the most advanced that's going on anywhere in the world in voting and elections is what's happening in Los Angeles. States make decisions what equipment to use and what not to use. They usually base it on the voluntary voting systems guidelines that come out of the EAC, but they don't have to. Some states do their own thing. And a lot of things at the state level get outsourced to private industry. The cities and counties also have their own level, and again, this differs from one place to the next. So no matter what you think you know about elections, it's probably right in some places and wrong in others because there's so much variability. Anyone have any idea how many election jurisdictions there are in the United States? Let's have some guesses. Come on, somebody guess. Because you know there's 50 states, and the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico, and Guam, and so on. I'm sorry? Thousands, okay. Anyone want to be more precise?
5,000.
5,000. Do I hear?
3,007.
3,007. We're going to do this as an auction. I heard 5,000, 5,000, 5,000. Going once. Do I hear 6,000, 6,000? And do I hear 6,000?
1,100.
No, we have to go up. This is an auction.
Are we counting the polling places?
No, I'm not counting the polling places. I'm counting the number of unique government jurisdictions responsible for election.
Okay, so water board, police.
Well, those are you. And by water board, you mean the board of water, not waterboarding.
Right.
Those are sort of the offices, but I'm referring to the organizations that run the elections. How many organizations run elections? So it depends on exactly how you count it, but it's between 8,000 and 10,000, 10,500. I've seen different numbers, but there's that many different organizations, each of which more or less sets their own rules. And that's one of the challenges. Think about if you, every web site developer had completely different rules and didn't have HTML and HTTP and all the other sort of standards that we rely on that make things interoperable. Everyone did their own thing. Well, that's what we have with elections. So computers get used in all sorts of pieces. We tend to talk about the computers in voting places, in polling places, but there's a lot of other places that computers get used also besides the polling places. They're used for voter registration systems, for election management systems. Those are the systems that are used to program the ballots. They call it programming, not programming in the sense that software engineers think of programming, writing Java code or something like that, but rather configuring to say that a bubble colored in here means a vote for Smith, and a bubble colored in here is a vote for Jones, and this is how they should appear on a screen if you're using screens or on paper. So that's ballot programming. So election management systems are used to do that. And then there are electronic poll books, and I'll talk about those, and voting machines, vote tabulation. So there's a whole bunch of places. So let's start digging into these a little bit. So voter registration systems, they're largely customized. Every state has their own. There's no real off-the-shelf solutions. That's not entirely true. There's some commonality between states, but they're really mostly different, and that's good and bad from a security perspective. It means that if say, a Russian hacker decided they wanted to attack voter registration systems, each of them is not the same, so they have to figure out each one. But it also means that because they're not the same, there's no economies of scale in securing them, because you have a whole bunch of really crappy ones instead of a few good ones. There are no federal standards for these, and we all heard after the 2016 election how the Russians were attacking them, in some cases successfully. So that actually brings me to a question. The states all said, you know, they attacked us, but they didn't get in. Do you think they're right? Don't really know. We know from other FBI data, not relating to elections, but relating to commercial sites like banking sites and things like that, we know that it typically, you don't find the attack until 3 to 6 months after the attack happens. So if things happened, pronouncing on the day after the election we weren't hacked probably is not very meaningful.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Did they get into Illinois in 2016?
The reports where they got into Illinois, yeah. There were a couple other states that I think they got into, yeah. But I'm not sure that I believe that those are the only ones they got into. Yeah.
Jeremy?
Yeah.
Quick question. So, related to this, so the alternative would have been some kind of a wonderful federal standard and some guidelines and some homogeneity. But that potentially would lead to a monoculture. Monocultures are problematic, right?
This is the back and forth. This is why I say the advantage is that you have a whole bunch of unique systems, each of which the attacker needs to go after individually, but they're probably all crap when it comes to security, versus a monoculture where once you find one hole, you're in, and it's just this constant trade-off. Yeah.
I'm curious about the idea of a monoculture and how you would enforce any sort of minimum standard with a great diversity of funding and technological prowess across the country.
Yeah. Absolutely true. There are some efforts to use open source as a way to try to address some of these problems. The problem is that states don't have a lot of money to spend on developing technology, and one state is not all that enthused about spending its money to build it that all the other states are going to take advantage of. There have been some efforts in this area, not just for voter registration systems, but for a wide variety of different voting technologies. And what you sort of need is the states to come to agreements to create their own consortia of who want open source solutions. But for political reasons, a lot of times that's very hard. So, some of you have probably heard last summer, DEF CON in Las Vegas. There was a lot of news media coverage, and we'll come back to this again later. But one of the things that was a big headline was 12-year-old kids successfully break into voter registration systems. It wasn't true. They broke into a mock-up that was designed to be vulnerable as a way of teaching 12-year-olds what hacking is about. So this is one of the challenges, is we have to distinguish between the real things that happen and the things that were sort of demoed. So let's talk about 2018, November 5th, Monday of this week. It was all, for those of us on the inside of the voting space, there was a huge blow up that someone had figured out how to hack the voter registration system in Georgia. And it was vulnerable to a trivial attack. But even calling it hacking doesn't appear to be accurate. There have been no details that I've seen, and I've been watching this, but the hints are that it was a URL manipulation attack. So you don't have to write a line of code. All you need to do is go into your browser, and there was some parameter in the URL that if you change that parameter, you could see or change anybody's voter registration data. There wasn't any authentication. Once you authenticated yourself so that you could edit your voter registration data, you could also modify anybody else's voter registration data. So it's a basic, trivial web application vulnerability. Doesn't require any programming. This is the one area where I'm going to get a little bit into politics, because in Georgia, the Secretary of State, which is an elected position, it's not an elected position in every state, but it is in Georgia, was running for governor, and he was responsible for this system. There had actually been a really serious breach earlier in 2018 against Kennesaw State University, where all of the voter data had been outsourced, and they got hacked, and so it was brought in-house. And the Secretary of State said he was going to clean this up and make sure that never happened again, and then the system promptly got hacked. And so he responded by doing what any good technologist would do: sue the Democratic Party. Instead of trying to solve the problem, he sued the Democratic Party. It's not clear how that helps, but that's what he's done. Yeah. So this is, hot off the presses. It's this week's news. So let's move. Yeah, sure.
Is the structure of who controls these systems and whose jurisdiction it is to sort of manage them, is that clearly established at least across 50 states, or is that even also not?
It varies. So under the Help America Vote Act that I mentioned, the HAVA Act, every state has to have a voter registration database for the entire state. But some states, the way they do that is the state manages it, and then they push the registration data down to the localities. And in others, the localities maintain their own data, and they push it up to the state to maintain that database. And then the software that's used, and the methods, and the laws, and the policies, and all that stuff is different everywhere. There's no standardization on any of this stuff. So that makes it really hard. Okay, so moving away from voter registration systems, I told you I was going to try to hit on a bunch of different areas and give you a sense of the landscape. Electronic poll books. An electronic poll book is basically an application that runs on a laptop or a desk or a tablet or something like that, that allows you to check that someone is a registered voter and to check off when they've actually voted. Some of them use an online database, so they're accessing some central database somewhere using cellular modems or things like that to connect to a central database and update it. In some places, it's done as offline databases. So they download the database into each into each tablet or each laptop. The advantage of that is you don't have an online system with issues of someone doing a denial of service attack against that central database, and suddenly nobody in the entire state can vote because nobody can get to the database. On the downside, if you have it on a local laptop or tablet, now if you want to go into a polling place other than your own to vote, you can't. And so this is an area where the policy intersects with the technology. In some states, like where I live in Virginia, the law says you must vote in your polling place. You can't vote somewhere else. And this can be a real pain in the neck, because if somebody moves from one place to the other and they don't change their voter registration database or voter registration data, we have to say, sorry, you can't vote here. You can go back to where you used to live and you can vote there for some period of time, but you can't vote where you live now. Places like Colorado, which have what are called vote centers, so you can go to any vote center in Colorado, and if you're a registered voter in Colorado, and you can vote. You don't have to go to your neighborhood. You go to anywhere in the state, and you can vote because they're looking up against a central database. So that's a case where you need access to the central database, but the risk is now you have that central database that has to be online. There are risks with reliability, database manipulation, the user interface issues are pretty significant. All of these technologies are sold by private for-profit companies. None of this stuff is government-owned. None of this stuff is open source. And there are no federal standards. Each state decides what it thinks is good enough for these poll books. Interestingly, the best academic work in this area is at Ball State University in Indiana. And do you know what didn't happen at Ball State University? Only real news geeks will know this one. The Ball State Massacre. Do any of you remember the Ball State Massacre? That's because it didn't exist. It was something President Trump talked about. Seriously, look up the Ball State Massacre. It was an attack by, I think it was a bunch of illegal aliens in his telling, but it did not happen. There was no such thing, ever. Not recently, there was never such a thing. But Ball State University does the best work with electronic poll books. So now let's move on again into talk about the voting systems. These are the systems that you and I encounter when we go to our polling place. So there's several types of them, and I'm going to briefly go over what they are, and then we'll get into some examples of what happened in 2018. So, how many of you voted this year? How many of you voted in a polling place as opposed to voting by mail? A few. Okay. For those of you who voted in a polling place, what technology did you use?
The machine was broken, so we'd use a pen.
Okay, so you hand marked your ballot.
Yeah.
What would you have used if the machine wasn't broken?
It sort of looked like a black suitcase on legs. I don't really know what
Is it a computer, or is it a
I think it was digital, yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, I was actually there. I was there when the machine broke, so I had to undo my machine vote and do a paper one. But it was a booth that opened up to a screen. It appeared to be a touch screen, but it actually had a wheel dial
Okay.
that you chose to like scroll through everything and press yes or no on each one.
Right, and we'll have a picture of that a little bit later. So that's an iVotronic, I think. Yeah, anyone else?
The same thing, iVotronic.
iVotronic, okay. Okay. Was that here in Orange County?
Yeah,
Okay. Okay. All right. So first let me talk about optical scan, and then we'll talk about those sorts of things that some of you were talking about. So optical scan is, if you've ever taken an SAT, I understand GREs are now online and things like that, but SATs I think are still done on paper. Is that true? Any of you go to high school recently enough that you remember?
They're still on paper.
They're still on paper? Yeah, okay. And actually, one of the reasons that they're on paper is the same reason that it works well to use them for voting on paper, and that is, if more people show up than you're expecting, you just take out more pencils. So this is one of the real advantages of hand-marked ballots, is if lots of voters show up, you just take out more pencils and you keep going. If you're using a computerized system, you end up with a line. And so you end up with shorter lines if you use less technology for the voting part. For the voter registration part, and I didn't talk, I'm sorry, not voter registration, for the poll book part, and I didn't talk about this on the last slide, using technology makes the lines shorter. So it's kind of interesting that the check-in technology is much faster, but the voting technology is much slower when you add technology. So there are two basic conceptual models for optical scans. One is you mark your ballot and you put it in a scanner, and that scanner looks to see whether you're whether you've under or overvoted, and I'll describe those in a second. And the other is you just mark it and then you mail it, or it goes in a box and it gets carried away to some central scanner. And the problem with using a central scanner is if you made a mistake on your ballot, you don't know. If you voted for too many candidates, you'll never know. You don't get a warning. The general advantage of both of these is they're cheap, they're scalable, but they are vulnerable to voting errors. So hanging chads, the modern equivalent of hanging chad is somebody who starts marking the ballot and then changes their mind after they started coloring in the bubble for Smith and said, no, I didn't mean to vote for Smith, I meant to vote for Jones, and they color in both of them, or they color in, maybe they just put a dot in the one that said Smith, and then they colored in Jones. Which one did they really intend? And so now it comes down to an interpretation question. One of the big downsides for these is the chain of custody is critical. You need to make sure that nobody took the ballots out of the ballot box and put different ballots in. This isn't much of a threat in the US. I'm not going to say it's not a threat at all. It is in some countries, in India in particular. There's a concept called polling place capture, and what that means is somebody during the middle of an election comes up in a truck with a gun and says, give me your ballots, here's the new ballots, and then they go away and burn the old ones. So if that's your threat model, then you have a different set of concerns than if you're assuming that they're okay, that people aren't trying to manipulate them. It's not, I don't mean to make it sound like India is the only place where it happens. It happens in other places too. But in recent years, that hasn't been a threat here in the US. So that's one class, which is the optical scan. A second class of voting machines are the direct recording electronics, or DREs. The ones you talked about are examples of that. And those are typically touchscreen machines. They're theoretical, user-friendly, accessible to people with disabilities. And they've all been shown to have horrible security. Some people talk about the advantage of hand-counted paper. It's really simple. It's widely used in Europe, where they have much simpler elections. I don't know how many things were on the ballot here. It's not uncommon in California to have 100 things on the ballot, and if you have to count 100 different contests by hand, it takes a long time. Internet voting, we'll talk about this more. At this point, it's promoted as increasing turnout, but it doesn't actually happen. One of the few places where it's ever been used in the US was in Honolulu, and turnout dropped, but it isn't clear whether it was dropping because of the technology or whether it was dropping because people weren't interested in the election. It's a very complicated question, but in general, the results are that internet voting does not increase turnout. And I end this slide with, we're not using the internet, we're using email. I've heard that from many election officials who think that email is completely independent of the internet. And it's like, no, it's still using the internet, because they say we can't be hacked because we're not using the internet, we're using email. Okay, so what sort of systems actually get used? This is a great map from verifiedvoting.org, and it shows the types of technology that are in use around the country. And then for more color, here's where internet voting is used. And internet voting is, in most states, actually maybe in all states, is only used for military and overseas voters. It used to be in Alaska, anybody could use it, but I'll get to that again later. But there's a lot of states, and you can see in the lower right, most of the country that uses internet voting is using email voting. So let's give a good example. So you're, this is actually the same device you were using. You see the picture with the wheel. We typically say touch screens when we're talking about DREs, but one of the models, including the model you use here and the model they use in some parts of Texas, doesn't use a touch screen. It uses a wheel. It's more similar to an old, what were they called? The Apple iPods, right, iPods, where you have a wheel you turn and then a button you click. And so the problem in Texas was these are really old processors. These are 15 to 20-year-old processors and really old software. And there's apparently a bug that it queues up the clicks. And if you chose a straight ticket and then you chose a candidate and you clicked on them too close together, it would lose the position and it would have the opposite effect of what you intended. It doesn't appear to have been a hack. It doesn't appear to be a vulnerability. It appears to be just a plain old bug that, because people are getting more accustomed to interacting with all these devices, they just move faster using them. And so it's the change in user behavior coupled with really old technology. So it's just, this happened to a bunch of people, and it doesn't happen every time. It's a timing related thing. I said earlier when I was talking about hanging chads, Florida, if it's an election, there's always a Florida story. That's just one of the rules of elections. There's always a Florida story. So I mentioned undervotes and overvotes, but I didn't define them. Does anyone know what an undervote or an overvote is, or anyone want to take a guess?
Is it not selecting a candidate in a contest?
And an overvote is selecting too many. I should have gotten my timing better. You can tell why I never make it as a comedian. So the notion is that it's not a requirement to vote for everything that's on the ballot. And here in California, a lot of people don't vote for a lot of the things. We talk about them being down ballot. So the things at the top of the ballot are usually president, senator, governor, things like that. And the down ballot things are like water boarder.
Judge, whatever.
Judges, there's some states like California, you have judge retention or judge election. I don't remember which it is.
A lot of this was just yes or no, I don't know.
Yeah, that's called retention. In some cases, they're competitive, and in some cases, they're retention. So a lot of people tend to skip the lower down stuff, and that's not uncommon. But in Florida, what happened in the Florida 13th Congressional District, it says 2016, but that's wrong. That's a typo. That's 2006 that this happened, where the congressional district spans several counties. And the people in Sarasota County, which makes up part of the 13th Congressional District, undervoted for the House of Representatives at about the 15% rate. So in other words, 15% of all voters didn't vote for anyone for Congress, but they did vote for other things. But the people in the neighboring counties that were also part of the same 13th Congressional District, they only voted by 2 to 5%, which is what you typically see for a congressional race, for an undervote rate. So people sort of said, why? Was this a bug in the software? And there was a lot of allegation that it was deliberate because Sarasota is more Democratic than the other parts of the congressional district. And so there was a lot of allegation that this was a deliberate attempt to tamper with it until somebody actually started looking at the ballots. And so this is what part of the ballot looked like. So this was the first page of the ballot in Sarasota County. So it says in red up there, official general election ballot, Sarasota County, and then it says congressional, in blue, United States Senator, vote for one. And most of the pages, you see at the bottom, this is page 1 of 21. So this ballot went on for 21 screens. And I just excerpted a couple of these. So the second screen looked like this, and it has this blue thing that says governor and lieutenant governor, and so people saw that. But up above here, that's where the congressional race was. But your eye is drawn to this blue thing, just like it was drawn over here. Your eye is drawn to the blue thing here. In other parts of the 13th Congressional District, the congressional race wasn't up above on the screen. It was on a separate screen. And so people saw it. Or maybe it was on paper, I don't remember which. So this is what happened in 2006. And they actually, it took a while, but somebody actually ran some tests. with human subjects, something you're really good at here, with doing HCI tests, and they found that people undervoted. They just didn't see that race at the top of the screen.
So was this intentional by any chance? Or?
It appears not to have been intentional. It appears to just be bad ballot design. There's no indication that it is intentional. Let me put it that way. So that was 2006. Now let's look at 2018. I know you can't see this, but on the left is Miami-Dade, which is the city of Miami and surrounding area, and over here is Broward County, which is Fort Lauderdale. And it's more or less the same contest. So I'm going to show you where things are. So you have a box over here with instructions in English and Spanish, and a much longer box here, and I don't know what language this third one is, but they have different, it depends on the census results, what languages you have to have. So the instructions are there, and then the Senate race is down here versus here, and so on, and so things end up in different places, and the result is that a lot of people just sort of in Miami-Dade, because there were the Senate race was the hot thing that everyone was discussing, and the representative was and governor, these were the things people were talking about, but because it was much further down in Broward, a lot of people skipped these races here, and they went straight to the top of the next column. And so they skipped what we would call the top of ballot races, and they went straight to the down ballot races. And so you get what I said here. This is a quote from the Tampa Bay Times. The votes in Broward for the state cabinet races outnumbered the votes cast in the Senate race. 13,000 more voters chose a candidate for Attorney General, and 9,000 more votes were cast for Commissioner of Agriculture than for Senate. And that is completely backwards. And what is this? This isn't a security flaw. This is an HCI flaw. They designed the ballot wrong. Okay, so now let's talk about another one. This is also 2018. Donna Curling versus, I don't remember Kemp's name. Kemp is the same Attorney General who was responsible for the machines that got hacked, the voter registration systems. He got sued by some citizens, including Donna Curling, who's an activist, to get rid of these touchscreen voting machines. I love this quote from U.S. District Judge Amy Totenberg. The court advises the defendants, because the state of Georgia said, we can't fix this. We don't have enough time to fix these voting machines or to switch over to paper. The judge said, further delay is not tolerable when they're confronting and tackling the challenges before the state's election balloting system. Sorry, I understand you don't have enough time. I'm going to let you get away with it. The state's posture in this litigation and some of the testimony and evidence presented, much of which was presented by professors, I might point out, at Georgia Tech and University of Michigan and other places, indicated that the defendants and the state election officials had buried their heads in the sand. How often do you get a judge to say, these people buried, literally, she says they buried their heads in the sand and ignored the security risks of these voting machines. I just love that quote. That's so cool. Okay. There's more cases, but let's move on to a different topic. I'm going to do this one because I saw this in my polling place. Did I vote a blank ballot? No, actually, I'm going to skip this one because I'm running out of time. Blockchain is the answer. What was the question? Have any of you heard of Votes? A company called Votes in West Virginia. They're doing this, what they're calling the first internet voting experiment. It's not really. It's the first possibly blockchain-related experiment. West Virginia, it mixes two concepts, online voter registration, identification with voting. It has you take a picture of your ID, and it has you take a picture of yourself, and you have to, or a video of yourself, and it has to include you blinking, and then they have you do various other things. They give you instructions what needs to be in the video to make sure it's really a live video and not taking a picture of a photo or something like that. And they mix that with what they claim to be blockchain, but it's not a public blockchain, it's a private blockchain that only they can see and nobody else can see, so is it really blockchain? Or is it really just a private database? and they won't let anybody test it, but trust us, it's secure. West Virginia is arguing it's just a few votes, but the vendor has the goal of doing it everywhere. And then there was this op-ed.
What is the problem they're trying, again, sorry, I missed that. So what exactly is the problem they're trying to solve through blockchain again here?
So why are they claiming it's blockchain?
No, it's okay, that's fine, but what's the problem? Is it voter registration, or is it voting?
This
or?
is for voting. This is for online voting.
Oh, I see, I see.
And they're claiming that online blockchain solves all problems. That's why the subject line of this slide. If it's blockchain, it must solve the problem. There was an op-ed that appeared earlier this week in the New York Times that said it's time for online voting, and it says the key weakness of early online voting systems was the inability to solve the double spend problem. It turns out they set up a red herring. They say, this is the problem. We've solved it with blockchain. Well, that actually wasn't the problem, and it doesn't solve it. The problem isn't double spending. It's malware on voters' computers. It's hacking. It's remote authentication. It's all these other things. Blockchain doesn't solve the hard parts and makes the easy parts riskier. And one of the things that scares me is if you put your ballot on the blockchain, you encrypt your ballot and put it on the blockchain, and then someone figures out how to manipulate the encryption in the blockchain, we can retroactively decrypt your ballot and violate your secret ballot. How would you like it if 10 years from now, when you're applying for tenure, someone says, you voted for Trump? I didn't say that, did I? No. Okay. So Arvind Narayan at Princeton has put this out on Twitter, and basically everybody has been agreeing with him that, you know, it's this really interesting thing. You have the vendors on one side and the blockchain aficionados saying blockchain solves world hunger and voting is just an easy problem. And then on the other side, you have the scientists saying, no, it doesn't solve the problem. Okay, and there was this article, I don't remember what magazine this was in. A horrifically bad idea, smartphone voting is coming. Okay, let's talk about post-election audits for a minute, changing topics again. I told you I was going to skip over a bunch of topics. The goal of post-election audits is to do a random sampling, or a-sampling, to convince yourself that the machines counted the ballots correctly. Risk-limiting audits are a specific kind of audits that are using statistical sampling to give yourself a confidence interval that if I compare what the machine claimed this ballot said and what a human says this ballot said, and if I get enough of those that I've selected randomly, then I can have statistical confidence at whatever confidence level you wanted without having to look at all the ballots. This is starting to happen. Colorado is the furthest along with this. California does a little bit of it. Virginia's doing a little bit. Rhode Island is doing a little bit. But this is sort of the wave of the future, is to use risk-limiting audits. So if you Google risk-limiting audits, the guy who leads, who's done all the scientific work behind it, is a professor at UC Berkeley. What about DEF CON? So I talked a little bit about DEF CON earlier. DEF CON demonstrated how easy it is to hack a lot of the DREs and also some of the other systems. Nearly everything that was demonstrated at DEF CON, it got great headlines. It got people to pay attention. But almost everything they did had previously been done by academics. It was really sad. It was like, wow, we showed that you can break into this system and do, you know, well, that was published 10 years ago. So I'm frustrated in case you can't tell. Election official response in some cases was uninformed. There were some election officials who went there and said, wow, this is really dangerous. We better do something about it. And others who said, nobody could possibly do that. They don't have whatever capabilities. A lot of election officials don't understand what well-intentioned grad students with too much time can do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, not to disagree with you, but the academic research that you're referring to was very cool, and as an academic, I appreciated it when it came out. But it was all of the type like, well, you know, if you freeze it in a deep freezer, you know, and you beat it with a rubber trench, you know, then you probably can get it to do some mean thing. But in the real place, so the DEF CON demonstration is much better in that sense because it was in a public place in the way that machines are supposed to be used.
It was closer to the real world, you're right. But there wasn't anything that, so there was a thing I'll mention in just a second, and I'm running out of time, so called the California Top to Bottom Review, where the Secretary of State of California hired a bunch of faculty, mostly from universities in California, to look at the voting machines in use in California, and they published a report which is still available, I checked today, and pretty much 90% of what they showed at DEF CON was in those reports that were published in 2007. So, yeah, they demonstrated it more practically, but okay. I talked about the voter registration system hack, so I'm not totally ignoring you, but I'm running out of time. Okay. One of the advantages of DEF CON was Alaska had been allowing anybody who wanted to do internet voting. After they saw what happened to DEF CON, they stopped. So that was good. It's a requirement of any CS talk. You have to have an XKCD comic in here. The point of this is that if you talk to scientists in almost any other area, they'll tell you, use our technology, use our science. Voting is one of those areas where the computer scientists say, don't do that, don't do that. It's kind of odd compared to other sciences. And XKCD, does anybody not know XKCD? If so, you need to, you faculty members are not doing your job. Okay, I mentioned the California Top to Bottom Review. It's worth reading. The Ohio Everest study was similar, looking at a bunch of voting machines, but those are 10 years old. So the National Academies of Science was funded just this year. They came out with a report about 2 months ago. It was funded by the Hewlett Foundation and several other private foundations, and came up with a bunch of results. And then I was one of the co-authors of a report that came out from a group of nonprofits saying why you shouldn't do email and internet voting. And remember I just said a few minutes ago that email and internet and people don't understand it. And I don't like the title email and internet voting, because email voting is internet voting. I couldn't convince the other authors to change it because the public thinks of email as not the same as internet. So I said we should call it email and web voting. And they said, no, email and internet voting. So that's why the title is that way. The National Academy of Sciences came up with this 150-page report. You can download it. It's free. It's easy to read. This is the table of contents. And let me show you what they said in particular about internet voting. At the present time, the internet should not be used for the return of marked ballots. Further internet voting should not be used in the future until and unless blah, blah, blah. And U.S. election assistance standards should be revised as follows. But it came out in no uncertain terms, and this is the most prestigious scientific group in the country says, don't do it. Okay, have to say, we're researchers. We need further research. What are some of the areas where we need further research? Not surprisingly, some of these are in usability. Of course, a lot of them are security also. I do not touch on cryptographic end-to-end systems here, but making them more understandable is important, and I can talk to anyone who wants to later. But don't believe everything you read. Does anybody recognize the website this came from? Yeah?
Like the weird odd correlations.
Yeah, Spurious Correlations is what it's called. So this is the correlation of, I just love this website. Because there was a discussion on one of the email lists about did Democrats win or lose more in states that have paper ballots compared to DREs? And it's like, there's so many other confounding variables that I pulled up Spurious Correlation, and I shared some with the other people, and some people didn't like that I said that, but other people did. So this one maybe isn't so relevant to you. This one is. There's a high correlation between revenue from arcades and computer science doctorates in the United States. So you should be paying attention. You don't believe me?
That seems more correlated than the last one.
So Google Spurious Correlations if you're interested. You basically, you choose from a list of things, and then it'll find things that are correlated. Okay.
There's a little plausibility to that slide, though, right?
I'm sorry?
There's some plausibility here, though, right? Because a lot of computer scientists start off as like gamers or something or playing around
Should
with.
go the other way. It should be a reverse.
That is a discussion over a beer. Okay. So here's the summary. DREs, bad. OpScan is the best we have, but not perfect. Internet voting, really bad. Blockchain, a solution in search of a problem. The good news is we can no longer need to convince election officials of the risks. They get it now in a way they didn't when I started talking about this 10 years ago. The last 4 things on here I put in square brackets because I didn't talk about them. And of course, more research is needed. So I made it with 2 minutes to go. Any questions? And then I'll let you do something else. Yes?
I'm really interested in like the narratives that are crafted out of this sort of like discussion. Because I actually used to work for the Secretary of State's office way back when Deborah Bowen was in office and she was implementing a lot of
Right, she led the top to bottom review. She was great.
Yeah, but so I was talking to a lot of voters during the time because I was brought the voters hotline, and there was a lot of voters who thought that this technology would lead them to having their information stolen or their ballot thrown out.
Right.
And that narrative is very different than the narrative that we're seeing today, where people are using this kind of discussion to discredit even the system itself, right? Like the electoral system. So, based on how prevalent this issue is to the public outcry of it, how do we get to that? Is there a level of voter fraud or voter issues with machines that people should actually be scared about?
Yeah, for those of you who have classes, I won't be offended if you leave or if you just have something better to do with your time. It is a real challenge. I had people who came in, so I'm a poll worker. I spent Tuesday from 5 a.m. till 9 p.m. earning $150 as a poll worker. And even by graduate student standards, that's pretty bad. And there were people who came in and said, oh, I don't trust paper ballots. I want those electronic voting systems because the paper could be manipulated. And which to me, as a researcher in this area, I recognize that in fact paper can be manipulated, but the risk of manipulation of the electronic systems is much higher. A lot of this does tie into the political stuff with people saying, both politicians and non-politicians saying the system is rigged, that sort of thing. And it's pretty hard sometimes to draw a line between these systems are really insecure and we need to make them better and they're rigged. We saw this after the 2004 election where the president of Diebold said that he was going to deliver Ohio for President Bush when he was running for re-election. And a lot of people took that to mean that he was going to do whatever he needed to do to manipulate the votes because Diebold at the time was the biggest vendor of voting equipment in the country. I believe that it was a really poor choice of words, but I don't believe he was trying to manipulate votes. But it's the sort of stupid thing that somebody said that caused a lot of reaction. I don't know how we're going to get past this, especially in these very partisan times, but that's certainly an issue. Yeah. We'll make this the last one, and then we'll. There's cookies or something down on the first floor. I want a cookie.
So can you maybe comment a little bit about the trend of the technology in the voting system, like maybe ultimately like 10 years, 20 years later, what do you think would be the technology like used by most of the places in United States?
That's a great question to wrap up on. So there are several things going on. There is an organization of mostly academics that is being funded by private foundations and some of big companies that you've heard of, but I can't say, that are working on building a secure from the ground up voting system that'll use cryptographic technologies and other technologies. So in 20 years, I hope we're actually going to have secure electronic systems. But until those are ready, which I think are going to take 15 or 20 years, the best technologies we have are paper. and in particular, what's going on in Los Angeles, which is designing their new voting system with, they did huge numbers of interviews with voters, and they've done really serious usability studies and stuff like that. I think that's where the action is to make things better for the immediate term, and then over the longer term to build on some of these research technologies.
That's great.
So that's a great thing there is hope for the future.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.